All right, folks, let's put on our tinfoil hats today because things are going to get a bit weird in this video. On Monday this week, we talked about how changing interest rates can affect the economy. In today's video, we're going to continue with that theme by talking about how inflation comes into the picture. Before we begin though, I want to say that I am obviously not an economist. I do have an educational background that is partly in economics and a decent amount of self-study to go along with it. But at the end of the day, I'm just a 28-year-old dude on the internet trying to understand what the heck is going on right now in the world. So, some of my research has led me to consider the possibility that the institutions of our society have either intentionally or incompetently, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes, have allowed inflation to run hot to perform an action called financial repression. In an International Monetary Fund working paper titled The Liquidation of Government Debt, they speak about financial repression being used as a tactic to essentially devalue government debt when paired with, quote, a steady dose of inflation. I think we've had a bit more than that. So let's go down the rabbit hole together. What is hyperinflation? Okay, I'm gonna take this off so hopefully you guys can take me a little bit more seriously for the rest of the video. Hyperinflation is typically categorized as a period of time where inflation exceeds 50% year over year. Now, the United States or the developed Western world has never experienced inflation levels this high or anywhere close to it. But a few countries around the world unfortunately have had inflation this high, and it has had devastating effects on their economy. Today, according to the CPI in the United States, inflation is nowhere near those levels. So let's get one thing clear right now. I think some of the calls for a hyperinflationary scenario in the developed Western world are greatly exaggerated. In order for inflation to get up to those 50% levels, it would have to increase by a crazy amount. However, inflation is definitely currently elevated. Our last official CPI print came in at 7.5% year over year, which is some of the highest inflation we have seen in many years. There was a period of higher inflation in the history of the United States that you can see took place during this time. But here's the interesting thing. While inflation running high is generally seen as a bad thing for society overall, it can actually be used as a tool in some cases by governments in order to benefit their balance sheets. To unpack what I mean by this, let's look at a few important metrics. The first measure I want to show you is the debt to GDP ratio of the United States. This gives us an idea of how much debt a country has relative to how its economy is performing. The higher this ratio, the more credit the country is trying to use to produce real goods and services in the economy. Now, we can see that currently the ratio is higher than it has ever been, even higher than it was during World War II. This is extremely significant to pay attention to. The nominal amount of debt is unprecedented, but also its relation to economic production. Now, under normal circumstances, a country can have more debt than their GDP. This is fine, especially if you're someone like the United States who holds the world's reserve currency. And that's a very important point right there. Since the United States holds the world's reserve currency, it's very easy to find buyers for American debt. But if the debt were to grow at an unprecedented rate due to excessive money printing, it opens the door to foreign entities having less confidence in holding American debt, as well as the US dollar. Oh, actually, this is pretty related to that. One second. I'm currently actually reading Ray Dalio's newest book, which pretty much emphasizes this exact point. In the book, at least what I'm reading right now, is he basically chronicles the cycle that a world power follows, where they'll essentially rise to power, become a world reserve currency, but then they eventually collapse due to various factors. One of which being that they devalued their currency too much because of printing too much money, aka too much credit in the system relative to the amount of real goods and services within the economy. Before we go any further, I need to show you something. This is a 3/4 complete painting I did while following along with a Bob Ross video. Why am I showing you this? Because contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 by 164% from 1995 to 2021. While I don't think my painting would have done that, today's sponsor, Masterworks, would probably have better luck, especially during inflationary environments, which makes sense because of the precious nature of artwork. So check this out. Most of us normal people, aka non-multimillionaire billionaire people, we invest our money into things like stocks, bonds, crypto, real estate. We can afford these things, but we don't really own art, right? Like nice investment grade art. I'm talking what gets put up in like the top galleries. That's because it's super expensive. A Basquiat can sell for millions of dollars easily. This is where Masterworks comes in. You guys know I love companies who are democratizing the financial world, and that's exactly what they are doing. The way it works is Masterworks purchases artwork and then securitizes it, which allows them to basically split it up into shares. Aha, so this is what allows you and I to get in on the action. All it takes is just signing up on the website, browsing the collection, and then diversifying your money into this asset class with just a couple clicks. The cool thing is when it comes time to selling your shares, you have two options. You can either sell your shares to another member, similar to selling stocks, or wait until they actually sell the painting and then you'll basically receive your share of the proceeds from that sale. So check it out using the link down below, and if you use that link, you'll get priority access and then you can immediately start browsing to see what artwork they currently have available. And actually right now they have a really cool Banksy piece up. I was taking a little peek at it. Thank you to Masterworks for sponsoring this video. So all of this is to say that the United States will probably try and do everything in their power to stabilize their balance sheet and preserve the confidence in their currency. But to do that, it seems a difficult choice will have to be made. And that's because to reduce debt relative to GDP, well, you only kind of have two levers that you can pull. Either debt can be reduced by deleveraging, which is generally painful for society, or GDP can be increased through increased productivity. But that's difficult to do. Productivity just doesn't come out of thin air. It's often spurred by things like innovation or, increased credit in the system, which helps fund more things to produce productivity. So decreasing debt while trying to increase productivity, that's very hard to do. So then from my limited point of view, it seems like probably trying to increase GDP enough to bring down the debt to GDP ratio is very difficult. So perhaps the most likely path to pursue would be trying to reduce the debt. But the problem is, reducing debt is generally economically painful. That's because the basic method a government can employ to try and reduce their debt is to essentially be more fiscally responsible, which means either raising revenue, i.e. raising taxes, or decreasing its spending, or some combination of the two. That's not gonna happen. When have you ever heard a politician run a campaign saying, hey there, we're gonna raise taxes on you and we're gonna spend less money into the economy? There's a reason that politicians basically never take those actions, and more often than not, they do the exact opposite. So it's very rare to see a sitting government essentially try to take on short-term pain for long-term gain. But honestly, I don't think it's entirely their fault. Humans in general, we are just bad at making those types of decisions. We are not good at choosing short-term pain for a long-term gain. So I honestly don't think that we would collectively vote for somebody to even take those actions anyway. So if the government isn't going to pursue a situation where they're being more fiscally responsible by raising taxes and cutting spending, then how else can they reduce the debt? Well, this brings me to a sneaky way they can do it, and this is called financial repression. Financial repression is when conditions are created so that real interest rates can be negative. In order for this to happen, basically nominal interest rates need to be fairly low, and inflation needs to be higher than that. For example, 5% inflation and a 1% nominal interest rate creates a real negative 4% interest rate. And this financial repression basically erodes the value of debt because of that real negative interest rate. An easy way to wrap your head around this is to imagine that you loaned a friend $100 for 10 years and charged, let's say, 1% interest on that loan. Let's say for simplicity's sake that there was crazy inflation over those 10 years and that by the end of that period, $100 now has the purchasing power of just $10. Or in other words, you'd need $1,000 now to match the old purchasing power of your old $100. So you, the lender slash saver, you got screwed here, because after this loan is over, you're getting $100 back plus 1% interest on that. That's not going to cover all of this purchasing power that you lost over that time period. But the person who took that debt from you, they won big time, because now they have to pay you back way less purchasing power than that $100 originally was. This is what is happening with government debt right now. If that sounds a bit crazy to you, let's return to the IMF working paper titled The Liquidation of Government Debt. So reading from the abstract here, I quote, "Low nominal interest rates help reduce debt servicing costs, while a high incidence of negative real interest rates liquidates or erodes the real value of government debt. Thus, financial repression is most successful in liquidating debts when accompanied by a steady dose of inflation." But here's the catch. This financial repression does not come without a cost. Nothing in life is free. And guess who gets stuck with the cost? We do. Yep. You and me. Remember the example we just talked about when you were the lender or saver in that scenario and you lost a ton of your purchasing power? That's because financial repression directly hurts savers. Remember, financial repression involves the nominal interest rate being below the rate of inflation. The nominal interest rate is what we receive when we park our money in things like a high interest savings account. Right now, you'd be lucky to get 1% on an account like that, while inflation is soaring past 7%. That means you'd lose about 6% in purchasing power. But so did the debt that the government holds. So yes, financial repression does help the balance sheets of governments, and it helps them through the deleveraging process if that's what they want to do, but it also hurts savers at the same time. This is the reason why I'm really thinking you could build a case, like I said in the last video, that interest rates are not going to be going as high as people think they are. As I mentioned in Monday's video, I think you could reasonably guess that maybe we have reached, or we are about to reach, peak hawkishness of the Fed. Sure, in the short term, we may definitely get a rise in interest rates, but they can only go so high before financial repression stops being effective at essentially devaluing the debt. On top of that, if interest rates continue to rise, then the cost of servicing that debt becomes much more expensive. According to a recent New York Times article, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that if interest rates rise in line with their own forecasts, net interest costs will reach 8.6% of GDP in 2051. That would amount to about $60 trillion in total interest payments over 3 decades. And let's also remember that if interest rates continue to rise, then we run the risk of inverting the yield curve, which generally leads to a recession. So if I were to throw my hat in the ring here, my tinfoil hat, I would guess that interest rates are maybe going to be heading back down after a transitory hiking phase. Interestingly, this is also being priced in by the bond market. And check this out, for every previous tightening cycle we've had, we haven't been able to reach the height of the one before it. If that holds true once again, the federal funds rate may have a ceiling of 2% or may not even reach that high in this hiking cycle. So I'll admit here, once again, I am not an economist. This is just my amateur foray into trying to make sense of what's going on here and sharing what I find interesting with you. My take on this could be completely wrong. I'm very open to that possibility, and honestly, by me putting this out there, my hope is that if I am wrong, or if there are other perspectives to consider, then hopefully those will be pointed out to me and I can continue to improve my understanding. I don't actually think financial repression is a conspiracy. This was just for fun. It's a legitimate tool that's talked about publicly a lot, just not by your politicians. But it puts us, you and me, in a really weird spot, because while I'm sure we would all love our countries to be economically stable in terms of their balance sheet, I'm not sure we would like them to do it at the expense of our savings. And if we can't beat inflation by storing our money in lower risk assets like just savings accounts or bonds, then it basically forces us to chase higher risk assets, which then inflates the values of those higher risk assets. I still don't think that we'll see a hyperinflationary environment in the developed Western world, as I think that would be a very extreme case, but I think all of this that we've talked about today does lend some credence to the idea of holding Bitcoin in my portfolio anyway. And hey, maybe some shares in a Basquiat as well. That doesn't sound half bad right now. Remember to once again check out the link for Masterworks in the description down below. And with all that said, thank you so much for watching. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you again soon.